And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. Well, this is the final week of our three-part series, Brave, where we're talking about what it would mean to step out in faith and do the things that you've never done before that God might be calling you to do. In the first week, we talked about how when you step into the unknown, you're relying on your attributes rather than your skills, because skills are things that we acquire in preparation for what we know, for what we expect, whereas attributes are qualities that take us into any situation, especially unknown situations. And going into the unknown is bold, and that's what we talked about last week. We talked about how going into the unknown requires you to venture forth because you've never done it. You don't know what it's like, and yet you need to step out the way Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on the water. And we understand how scary it is to do that. In fact, I love this quote from Nona Jones. She's the director of faith-based relationships for Facebook. And she says this. She says, "You cannot make lasting impact while feeling safe." That if you stay where you're safe, then what's going to happen is that you won't change anything. Because change requires doing things that are new. And doing things that are new requires us to venture out of our safe zone. And so as we go out of our safe zone, as we go out of our comfort zone, that's a necessity for doing something that's going to have lasting impact. Because the things that have impact are things that change what used to be into something new. Now, in our story this week, we see some change happening. And the story begins with a woman who is approaching Jesus and the disciples. And this woman is identified as a Canaanite woman. Now, this means that she's an outsider. In the Gospel of Mark, where they tell essentially the same story, she's identified as Syrophoenician. And these are identities that, overlap and intermingle. But the main point is that she's not Jewish. She is not one of the Israelites who form Jesus' crowd, okay? And so they identify that this woman who is an outsider is approaching Jesus, approaching the disciples, and begging for help because her daughter is being tormented by a demon. Now, she's persistent, and so what happens is that the disciples tell Jesus that they want Jesus to send her away because she keeps coming after them. She's annoying them with her persistence. At first, Jesus just ignores her, but she's not taking that as a rejection. Instead, she keeps shouting after them, and so the disciples finally come to Jesus and say, "Look, can you please get rid of her?" And so finally, Jesus begins to speak with her, but it's not the kind of friendly conversation that maybe you would have expected. He speaks to her and says, "Look, I understand your problem," right? He says, "But I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." In other words, Jesus is saying, I have a very specific mission. I have a very specific mission, and he needs to be on that mission. And this, by the way, is one of the characteristics that Jesus shows throughout the Gospels. I mean, when he went to a town and people needed healing and people needed things from him, he didn't stay until the need ran out. He would move on when it was time for him to move on. He would rest when he needed to rest, okay? It's not as if he simply had his ministry controlled by the people to whom he was ministering. He had a larger purpose, a larger mission, and he honored that. When it was time to move on so he could move to where he needed to move to, he did that. And what he says to her is, look, you're basically outside of my mission. I am here for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And you're not one of them. And so to help you, to do something for you, would drag me off of my mission. Now, I don't know exactly why he said that, okay? We don't know about that. We don't know the particulars, but he says it. Maybe he's thinking that if he helps her, now everybody is going to be wanting help and not just the Israelites. But in whatever the reason is, he says, look, you're outside of my specific purpose. You're outside of what it is that I'm supposed to be doing, and so I can't help you. And in fact, he kind of says it in a way that isn't a particularly nice metaphor to use in that culture. In fact, it may be the least nice thing he ever says, all right? He says it's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now again, why does he say this? What are we supposed to learn from this? I'm not completely sure. There are a lot of theological arguments that I think are extremely abstract around the concept of what it means to be perfect. Now, we understand that Jesus did not commit sin, right? That's foundational to our understanding of Jesus, that he did not sin in his life. But these stories that are told of him, okay, are told to be taken at face value. You know, some people like to say, well, he's just testing her. Well, you know, in other parts of the scripture, when Jesus says something to test someone, the story says it. They said Jesus said it to test him. Okay, and so that's normally a part that's included. Since they didn't say anything, I think we're supposed to simply understand that he said what he said. And yet we understand it in the context of knowing that he did not sin. So let's just take what he said at face value and learn that this wasn't sin. He just said it. This is a distraction from my mission. And so my answer is no. But she takes his metaphor and throws it right back at him. She says, yes, Lord. What you said is right. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. He says, yes, I know that you came with a specific mission, a specific purpose to help this crowd, but isn't there enough to go around? Isn't there enough to go around? Isn't there excess? Isn't there some additional that can fall from the table and help those who are around? It's an incredibly insightful argument that she's making. She says, look, I know what you're here for, and yet you can do more. And I think there's a great lesson in this, in understanding this, because I think one of the things that happens to us sometimes is that we can be so focused on our purpose that we forget our purpose. There's a church consultant named Carey Nieuwhof, and not a church consultant, he's a pastor who blogs a lot about churches and sort of serves that function by his blog. And he talks about churches that fall in love with their methods to the point where they forget their mission. Okay, and I think that can happen. You have a mission, and then you develop a method to execute that mission, but then you fall in love with that method, even when the method isn't working as it used to help you further your mission. And he says at that point you have to choose. Are you going to stick with your method, or are you going to recalibrate in order to serve your mission? During this pandemic, we've seen all kinds of enterprises face this problem. I mean, every business out there is trying to figure out what they can do during this pandemic. And yet, figuring that out often means getting ever more focused on what it is that you actually do. What is your real purpose? What is it that you actually deliver to customers? Right? For example, I remember a story about the CEO of Starbucks years ago. They had switched to these new machines that were much more efficient at grinding the coffee beans, but they were totally self-contained in such a way that if you walked into a Starbucks, it no longer smelled like coffee. And it was definitely detracting from the user experience. And it was through smelling that, or not smelling it, that he understood that Starbucks wasn't just in the business of giving you a cup of coffee. It was giving you an experience centered around a cup of coffee. And so he ordered that they change the machines, because when you walk in, you need to smell coffee as a part of the experience that's coming with that cup. He was delivering an experience, not just a beverage. A lot of times we get distracted in these kinds of ways, right? Pulled away from understanding what we're really about. How many times have we seen a parent who says that they work really long, really hard, and they do it because it's all about providing for their family? And yet in the course of doing it, they work so long and so hard that it actually damages the relationships in their family. Maybe you've seen a doctor who got so focused on running their practice that they forgot about what it means to care for patients. Right? Again, that's where a person gets into it because they want to help, right? Because they want to heal. And so if they want to do that, they need to develop a practice, but then somehow the focus gets so narrowed in on the practice that they start to be less effective at delivering the help. You see, the purpose that we discern for ourselves, it provides the backdrop for our mission, for what we're going to do, for our methods. So we develop this purpose. What are we about? What are you about? And then you say, how can I live into that? And then when we decide how we're going to live into that, we have to be careful not to become hyper-focused on how we're living into it. That even when that method stops advancing our purpose, we hang on to it. You see, when the Canaanite woman lifts this up to Jesus and says, even dogs get the crumbs that fall, Jesus is impressed. And he says, great is your faith. And sometimes when people hear that phrase, great is your faith, I think that they believe Jesus is rewarding her persistence because she had been shouting. It didn't matter that she was being ignored. But I think it's deeper than that. When Jesus says, great is your faith, I think he's talking about her insight. I think he's talking about the fact that her faith is so great that she understands his mission in the broadest purpose. That his mission in the broadest purpose, yes, was to start with the house of Israel, but then eventually it was to bring that healing, to bring that salvation to everybody. Her faith was great because she saw beyond his immediate mission to the bigger reason why he came. She understood the bigger picture. And we need this reminder to stay focused on the bigger picture and then be ready to change course when we step out and realize that where we're headed may have worked at one time, but then stopped serving the bigger purpose, the bigger picture that was the reason we set out on that course in the first place. I mentioned last week listening to Craig Rochelle at the Global Leadership Summit, and one of the things that he said, which was really an interesting statement, was that when an old mindset is limiting your future, have the courage to unmake a promise. And that was such an interesting thing to hear a pastor say, because we think that our word needs to be our bond, right? And I certainly do. Right? Your word needs to be your bond. You don't want to unmake promises, and you don't want to be a person who goes back on their word. And yet sometimes we reach the point where we have to admit that maybe even the promise itself was a mistake. I think this statement is both true and a warning to us not to overmake promises. Because sometimes we're stepping out in faith, we're stepping out to do something new, we're trying to figure out what it is that we're supposed to be doing, and we think we see it. And then we say, this is it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And sometimes in that moment of being ecstatic about discovering what we think it is that we're supposed to be doing, we say, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. That you don't know. It may well be exactly what you should be doing right now. That as you find that you've been given this call from God to go step out in a direction, to do something, to get involved in something, and you say, yes, this is exactly it. Understand that that's exactly it in the moment. I remember when I was in driver's ed, they gave me a phrase that I've remembered ever since. They said, don't overdrive your headlights. In other words, right, at night you're taught that your headlights, you can see a certain distance, and you never want to drive so fast that you would not be able to stop the car in the time it would take the car to travel the distance that you can see with your headlights. Don't overdrive your headlights. Don't overpromise your vision, your ability to see what lies ahead. All right. I know here, even in the past, we would have storms, and sometimes churches would close in the wake of a storm. And we had canceled Sunday worship once in my first 15 years here. Once for a hurricane that was coming. That was the only time. They declared a state of emergency, and we didn't have Sunday worship that day. The rest of the time, even if there was a horrible blizzard, we had worship. Even if there were only 6 people here, we still had worship. And I said, we don't cancel worship on Sundays. We open the building. COVID came. Well, guess what? You have to unmake that promise in the face of new conditions, in the face of understanding what's out there. Sometimes you have to realize that the commitment you had made isn't the right commitment for now. See, when we step out boldly, we don't know what we're going to face. When we step out boldly, we are in the unknown. We're relying on our attributes, not our skills. We're doing something we've never done before. And when you do that, you may need to make a course correction. I love this meme that has gone around, and they don't know who said it originally, but I love this saying. Good decisions come from experience, and experience comes from bad decisions. When you step out in faith, you will make mistakes. And you will learn from those mistakes. And when that happens, all right, you need to be able to say that you've learned and change the decision that you've made. You need to stay focused on your larger purpose and understand that when my larger purpose is there, I may have to adjust the way I do things in order to serve that purpose. So be willing to step into the unknown. Be willing to rely on your attributes, not your skills. Know that when you step out, it's going to be frightening. And yet, lasting impact never happens from a place of safety. Stay focused on your purpose and be willing to change course. And that's what it means to go out and be brave. Amen.